lecturer tonight, Lisa Kaborycha, I can't pronounce it, Kaborycha, is a well-known scholar of the history of Florentine art and was a Florence resident. Between 2014 and 16, she was the Eugene Grant Fellow in Jewish History and Culture at the Medici Archive Project. And it's the results of her research in the Medici Archive Project that are the basis for the lecture she's going to give us tonight on Florence, the Medici, and the Jews during the Renaissance. So over to you, Lisa.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. It's always a pleasure and a great honor to give talks at the British Institute. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me because this is a version of a talk that I was asked to give several years ago at the Temple Emmanuel in New York City, based on my research that I was doing at the Medici Archive Project. That research I was doing was based on looking at archival documents from the 1590s and the early 1600s, specifically in the city of Pisa, and looking at Jewish activity there. That said, this lecture is completely different. This is going to be about the position of Jews in Florence during the Renaissance, and specifically in the Quattrocento, which is my field of study. I am not trained as a specialist in Jewish studies. I am actually a Renaissancist, and my field is paleography. I study old handwriting, and I had this marvelous job because I can read these documents and do archival work. So these were discoveries that I made as I was going along working at the Archivio di Stato in Florence. So my talk begins back in the Quattrocento. If I can get it to go. On December 15, 1494, the preacher Girolamo Savonarola mounted his pulpit to deliver one of his fire and brimstone sermons to the people of Florence. The reforming Dominican friar told them about the Jewish prophet Haggai, who preached to the children of Israel after they were freed from the captivity in Babylon, telling Israelites it was time to rebuild the temple. Savonarola exhorted Florentines that it was time to establish a new order in Florence, saying, "The man who is just and compassionate, God will always treat compassionately in his every need. Be sure then that you are compassionate toward the poor, and if your city has such citizens as we have said there must be, blessed will you be, Florence, for you will become that celestial Jerusalem." In the same breath, Savonarola refers to justice, compassion, and Jerusalem. But the question that this talk asks, was Florence a new Jerusalem for the Jews who lived there? Indeed, looking at the works of Savonarola, he does not have a lot of generosity and good feeling toward the Jewish people. In his Triumph of the Cross, Savonarola said, "For a very long time, no sign of sanctity or true religion has appeared among the Hebrew people. They have been distinguished for avarice and other sins. The gift of prophecy has failed among them, and God does not show by any sign that they are his people." Further on, he goes on to ask, why then have the Jews been scattered all over the face of the earth? His answer, with malicious perfidy and hatred, they have crucified the true Son of God. Predictably, he comes down with a very critical negative attitude towards the Jewish people. But why do I cite this? I'll be coming back to Savonarola later in today's talk, but I really want to underline the way these two examples illustrate how attitudes in Renaissance Italy towards Jews were both complex and contradictory. The Jews enjoyed long periods of peaceful coexistence that were punctuated by periodic outbreaks of persecution. But before going into Florence in the Renaissance, I want to give you a brief overview of Jewish history from the very beginnings on the Italian peninsula. Jewish history on the peninsula dates back to the time of ancient Rome. Jews had resided on the Italian peninsula since at least the 1st century BCE. Cicero, in his speech in defense of Flaccus, delivered in 59 BCE, describes the numerous Jews who were crowding around the speaker's platform. We also learn from Suetonius in his Lives of the Caesars that after Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, there were many, many Jews who were expressing their grief and thronging at his funeral ceremony because Caesar indeed instituted some very favorable policies towards the Jewish people. Now, I don't want to suggest that ancient Romans were enthusiastic about the Jewish faith. Indeed, Romans enjoyed mocking many of their practices. But the truth is that Judaism was the only legally tolerated cult in the Roman Empire outside the official pagan one. And this was a policy that continued even after the Jewish War, which included, of course, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. What you're seeing here is a detail from the Arch of Titus, from the inside, showing these Roman legions carrying away all the loot that they took from the temple before destroying it. Continuing, the emperors maintained rather favorable policies towards the Jews. For instance, the Emperor Caracalla, in his edict of 212 CE, in which he granted Roman citizenship to free inhabitants of the Roman Empire, he extended that to the Jewish inhabitants as well. With the fall of Rome, the sack of Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 410 CE, Rome became less populous. The peninsula started to decline and decay, but the Jews who had already been in Rome largely remained in Rome or else scattered throughout the Italian peninsula. But there has been a Jewish population in the Italian peninsula since that point. Now, during the centuries that followed, during the Christian Middle Ages, was a period of persecution of the Jews that grew over time. And there was many outbreaks of violence, slaughter, blood libel, scapegoating. We'll see, however, how Italy remained one of the most hospitable of the areas in Western Europe for the Jewish people. Much of this happened beginning with the First, Second, and Third Crusades. So during 1096, 1147, 1188, much of it took place in the Rhine and Danube areas in present-day France and Germany. Then in 1290, as you can see from the map, the Jews were expelled from England. In 1306, they were expelled from France. They were then again expelled from France in 1322, and once again in 1394. In 1348, German Jews fled persecutions following the Black Death, and some of them arrived from areas of the Alsace region, from the Rhine, to the areas of Eastern Europe, to current-day Poland. And you can see all those arrows pointing toward the region of Poland there. Now, while the Jews had been in Rome for over 1,000 years by this point, that medieval decline that I was speaking of the former caput mundi, made it unprofitable for Jews and Christians alike. There wasn't really a lot going on in Rome in the Middle Ages compared to the vibrant city-states of Italy. So many Jews of Italian origins migrated north from Rome, while other Jews were migrating south, as you can see from this map, from Germany and France. Now, I have just one more map to show you before I go on with more colorful slides. This is a map, I think, which is quite important to look at. You can see these little sort of skulls represent various massacres of Jews that occurred throughout this period. And you can see the areas of resettlement of Jews marked with those red dots. So you can see, for instance, as I mentioned, in Eastern Europe, many, many resettlements. You see many dots around various ports in the Mediterranean, but very importantly, you can see in Italy, Turin, Genoa, Livorno, Rome, Naples. Strangely enough, this dot, I think, is a mistake. It should be Palermo. There were a lot of Jews in Sicily during this period. This shows you quite dramatically where so much of the violence was in the exclusion and where Jews found safe haven and where it was considered a safe place to go. So now I'm going to get to Florence and to our story at hand. The commercial revolution of the Middle Ages began around the year 1000. This is when people started traveling again, trade started to move, there was circulation of people and goods, and many of the Jews would settle in the maritime republics of central and northern Italy. So you would see these populations in Genoa and Venice and Pisa, big centers of maritime commerce. Also in those city-states that I mentioned, the communes from Tuscany northwards was a place that was very hospitable to trade, and we find a lot of Jews settling there. By the way, many of these manuscript illustrations that I'll be sharing with you come from the edition by Metzger. They're lovely contemporary illustrations in Hebrew manuscripts. So Florence itself, however, was rather late to the table in terms of establishing a Jewish population. They were already present in Florence in the 14th century. However, Jews were not officially permitted to enter the city until 1427, but there was definitely a presence before then. It was somewhat later than other Tuscan cities, such as Siena and Pisa. Sometimes this illustration from Santa Maria Novella from Andrea di Buonaiuto or Andrea di Firenze's Via Veritatis is shown because there's this cluster of Saracens and Jews who Thomas Aquinas is preaching to. But I don't think that's a very persuasive idea of portraying that there was a Jewish presence in Florence, because you don't see the detail on Jewish garb. In fact, it's very difficult to identify which are the Jews and which are the Saracens. More convincing, especially Diane Owen Hughes has done a lot of research on this particular image, is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Sienese depiction of the purification of the Virgin. And Owen Hughes has demonstrated how items such as these headscarves and the earrings that appear here, these dangling earrings, could be representations of local Jews who lived in Siena at the time. So there's a reflection in the art of the time of this presence of Jewish population in the state of Siena. The two principal groups of professions that were attracted to Florence initially were bankers and physicians. Jewish physicians were widely sought out across Italy, especially in northern Italy throughout the Renaissance. And we see much evidence of Jewish medical practice in Florence during this time. Especially in Florence, notable is the fact that Jews were not subject to a prohibition on treating Christians as they were in so many other places. In fact, there's even documentation showing that Jewish doctors were occasionally allowed into convents to treat cloistered nuns, which is quite unusual. We also have documentation that very elite individuals, such as Simonetta Vespucci, was treated by a Maestro Moise Ebreo, a Jewish physician. Simonetta Vespucci was the beloved of Giuliano de' Medici, who also, by the way, was treated by a Jewish doctor, Shemuel Zarpati. His brother, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was in his final illness treated by a Jewish doctor who was sent specifically by the Duke of Milan, Ludovico il Moro, and that was Lazzaro da Pavia, who treated Lorenzo de' Medici. Here's just a list of some of the Jewish physicians who were operating in Florence at the time. And we know from the documents of the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild that a number of these were actually matriculated as physicians within the guild in Florence. Now, of course, you know that banking was big business in Florence, and that's what put Florence on the map in the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance. The European commercial revolution that I already referred to had taken off a while back, but when the gold florin was minted in 1252, the first gold currency minted in any quantity since antiquity, it took off and it became the currency of all of Europe. And Florence knew this boom in commerce, and banking was immense and very, very crucial to the development of this city. Now, that said, the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild might have been happy to welcome some Jewish doctors in, but the bankers were very, very suspicious of any outsiders coming in and wanted to keep out foreigners from their trade. By October of 1437, an accord was reached, and several months later, the first 4 Jewish banking houses were allowed to open up their Florentine banks, their branches. And we'll be seeing in a moment how that has a lot to do with Cosimo de' Medici, the Medici family influence. Aside from small-scale lending, Florentine bankers did not want the competition that Jewish bankers posed. And at first they tried to keep the Jewish moneylenders to just working in the outlying provinces in the Contado of Florence. And we also start to see legislation that indicates a backlash against Jewish participation. In 1439, the Florentine Commune passes a law requiring Jews to wear a sign. So in 1446, it was specified that Jews would have to wear a yellow letter O made of fabric or ribbon. Here you can see an image of members of the Norsa family in Mantua, and here you can see the sign that they're being forced to wear as an indication. Here's yet another manuscript from a Hebrew manuscript, an indication of a Jewish wedding in Padua in 1477. And the bridegroom, you can see on his shoulder, I've blown it up here, he's also wearing an identifying mark. But before I go any further, I'd like to emphasize something that I think is always important whenever talking about Jewish history, that it's important to recognize elements of exclusion, alienation, separation from the rest of the population. But I'd like to also talk about inclusion as well, especially when we look at the Italian context. Look at the bride, the way she's dressed. The clothing she's wearing, the veil on her head, her jewelry looks almost identical to that worn by the young woman in Filippo Lippi's portrait. So we're going to see so many points of connection between the Jewish population in Italy and also disconnection. It's important to point both of those out. But now, a very important moment for the Jewish community in Florence, the entry of the Medici on the political scene. The Medici had been in Florence for centuries, but it wasn't until Cosimo de' Medici, who inherited the banking enterprise from his father, Giovanni de' Medici, came on the scene of Florentine politics, that there was a real improvement in the fortunes of the Florentine people vis-a-vis the Florentine Republic. So Giovanni de' Medici had established the Medici Bank with in Rome with a very close connection with the papacy. What his son Cosimo did was expand the branches of the Medici Bank all the way across Europe. So it was an immense growth in the family enterprise under Cosimo il Vecchio, Cosimo the Elder. Cosimo, I'm not going to go into the details, was exiled in 1433 and returned to Florence in 1434 with a vengeance. And part of his objective when he returned, increasing the family fortunes and furthering his own banking agenda, was to also get the Jews accepted as bankers within the city of Florence. So after 1435, he was able to convince his friend, Pope Eugenius IV, to give the Florentines Jews permission for money lending. And that was something that Cosimo might have favored because it supported and enhanced his popular image amongst the poor in Florence, who could then go to pawnbrokers and pawn their goods for cash. It also provided money, ready money, for collateral for the big loans that Cosimo wanted to provide. Now, the smaller banking houses in Florence were not so thrilled about the participation of the Jewish bankers and their competition. But as far as Cosimo de' Medici was concerned, they really enhanced and helped his enterprise. Now, around 1400, in the 1430s, the Jewish community was quite small. It numbered only about 100 at the time that I was just discussing, but it grew into a sizable community quite fast. By 1456, there was even a synagogue, and I'll be showing you in a moment where that was located. But before I get to the actual map, what I'd like to talk about is how Lorenzo de' Medici, the grandson of Cosimo the Elder, really enhanced and favored Jewish fortunes within the city. In 1477, he blocked a decree that would have expelled the Jews from the Florentine commune. And he also, in 1488, diffused very violent emotions that were set off when the preacher, Bernardino da Feltre, very virulent anti-Jewish preacher, came to Florence, stirred up the populace, and incited the populace to violence against the local Jews. And he made sure that Bernardino da Feltre was ejected from Florence. And under Lorenzo's guidance, the city passed this ordinance that forbid anyone to do violence to or insult Jews, or for unruly mobs to gather within 400 yards of Jewish homes, and the penalty for disturbing—
No wonder he's Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Excuse me? Was the penalty of hanging. So he was quite favorable to the Jewish cause. Now, under Lorenzo the Magnificent, according to historian Marina Caffiero, Florence became the true Jewish financial center of the peninsula. And here, what I've got is a map on which I've superimposed in these sort of purple ovals the main Jewish neighborhoods in the Quattrocento in Florence, scattered across the city. One of the neighborhoods is centered around the synagogue. I'll get to that in a moment. And in other areas, this area in green is the 16th century ghetto that Jews were enclosed within. This predates the era of the ghetto when Jews lived across the city. Many of the Jewish neighborhoods were grouped around the primary Jewish banks. So you'll see, for instance, the Banca di San Romeo was located near the corner of Via dei Neri and Via della Mosca, right near the Piazza of San Remigio. Oops, sorry about that. The Banco alla Vacca was located where today's Via dei Pecori is located and Via dei Brunelleschi. The Banco di Santa Trinita is located in Palazzo Spini, or was located, it's not there anymore, between Via Tornabuoni and Lungarno Acciaioli. And finally, the Banco dei Ricci, very, very important Medici bank, was located in a portion of Via del Corso, basically from Via dello Studio to Via Santa Elisabetta, including the area around Via delle Ocche, where the paperback exchange is now. So that was another important Jewish center. Now, I mentioned that there was also, surrounding the old synagogue, a very important area. So here we have, we do not have an image of that synagogue. In fact, there was a remnants of that synagogue still existed in the area that I'll be showing you up until 1944, when during the bombing of the Lungarno, it was destroyed. But it might have looked like this. This is the inside of the synagogue from the region of Emilia around 1460. The synagogue was located here near the Torre dei Belfredelli on Borgo San Jacopo, just a few footsteps from down the river from the British Institute. In fact, this street, Via dei Ramaglianti, was once known as Via dei Giudei, the street of the Jews. And you can still see a plaque on the wall here on Via dei Ramaglianti that says ex synagoga, that says this is the site of the old synagogue. Of course not the new synagogue that you're all familiar with in the area of Sant'Ambrogio now in Florence. But this was the original site of the synagogue, the earliest one in Florence. All right, this presence of so many Jewish bankers and Jewish merchants also came with the synagogue, Jewish scholars, Jewish book illuminators, Jewish artists, Jewish artisans, and we start to see the patronage of these wealthy Jewish bankers, but also an immense production of books and treatises on various things. This is Guglielmo Ebreo's very popular treatise on the art of dance from 1463. And once again, the image that I used at the beginning slide for today's talk of these couples dancing from a Hebrew manuscript, we see men and women dancing together, wearing clothing, the that is typical of the Renaissance. So we see a certain amount of back and forth between the Jewish and the local culture within Italy. What I'd really like to point out are some of the exquisite manuscript illuminations that were produced during this time. One particular illuminator I'm going to focus on, his name is Mariano del Buono. So here is a Hebrew mazor that was copied by him in the second half of the 15th century. Very beautiful, elaborately illuminated with gold leaf, lapis lazuli, very beautiful mazor. But Mariano del Buono was so much in demand, he also illuminated Christian manuscripts as well. So this is from the same time period. This is in a collection of the Met Museum in New York City, and this was carried out by the same artist. So once again, we see that kind of interchange between the Jewish and the Italian culture during the Renaissance here. There were many, many Jewish artists, painters, engravers, gold and silversmiths who were active during this time. This is just a slight sample of the many things that were produced here. Probably the most popular Jewish artist, according to Schulwas, was Moses Castellazzo of Venice. He was the son of an immigrant from Germany, and he worked all his life as a painter, and he was especially well known for portraits. Very, very difficult to get one's hands on these actual objects because of the movement of the Jewish peoples and the constant need for changing countries and moving. The objects are not always readily available and are very precious today. But now I want to talk about probably the most single important contribution that Jewish culture here in Florence had on the intellectual development of Renaissance Europe. And it's an aspect I think that's essential, even if less decorative than the beautiful manuscripts and jewelry and other kinds of bling. So the influence on Florentine humanism is very important. It was a site of cultural exchange that is undeniable between local Jewish scholars and Lorenzo de Medici's circle of humanist philosophers, poets, and bibliophiles who were fascinated with Jewish culture. And I'm going to be dwelling on two of these individuals in particular, Marsilio Ficino, shown here at the far left, and Angelo Poliziano on the far right. So Ficino pursued a deep knowledge of Hebrew learning. He read many Jewish philosophical, religious texts, but he did a lot of that reading in Latin translation. His Hebrew was not fantastic. Poliziano, on the other hand, did have a direct knowledge of Hebrew and was able to read Hebrew Bible commentaries. Because during the Renaissance, there were two principal reasons that Christians wanted to learn Hebrew. One was for philological reasons, and the other was philosophical. So for philological reasons, it was to read the Bible in the original languages. In order to access the Old Testament, it was essential to know Hebrew. And the whole school of Christian humanism, which was led famously by Lorenzo Valla, was involved in getting that access to the actual Hebrew original texts. What I'm going to be dwelling on now, though, is Florentine Platonism, also known as Renaissance Neoplatonism, in which there was a need for learning more and more about various mystical traditions. That was very of great interest within the circle of Lorenzo's philosophical friends. Before I go further, though, on the mystical influences, I just want to say that there were a lot of Greek manuscripts flowing into Florence during the Quattrocento. So in 1439, the Council of Florence met here, and the Byzantine emperor was the house guest on Via Larga at Cosimo de' Medici's house. He brought gifts with him. Many, many Greek manuscripts started flowing into Florence. So we get works like this that's in the Laurentian Library today, Plato's philosophical works, many of which had never been seen in Europe throughout the Middle Ages until this point. Fortunately, the son of Cosimo's physician was a very gifted scholar called Marsilio Ficino. And he was brilliant in Greek and Latin, and he made the first translations into Latin of Plato's dialogues. And here you can see, also from the Laurentian Library, with the Medici coat of arms at the bottom in this very luxurious edition. So we're seeing the first translations of much of Plato entering Europe in Florence at this time and being studied at the Platonic Academy that was funded first by Cosimo de' Medici and continued, not just funded by Lorenzo de' Medici, but Lorenzo engaged in philosophical discussions with Ficino and the other scholars who were attracted to this place of study to read the works of Plato and to discuss Platonic ideas. Now, I'm not going to go into lots of depth about Platonism or Neoplatonism, just to say that there were certain Platonic ideals that fascinated this group of thinkers. The idea that there were certain eternal forms that existed in the universe, that in an imperfect, ugly, often smelly world that we live in, that we yearn for beauty. And this Renaissance idea of beauty, where did it come from? And Plato suggested that there were ideal forms that we can grasp and we can have access to. But the Florentine Neoplatonists explored that idea intellectually, but some wanted to go much more in depth into accessing those worlds, and they wanted to find the mystical key to those ideal worlds of perfect beauty and Platonic forms. And they experimented with a lot of different mystical traditions from across the world. That some of the Neoplatonists were fascinated with astrology. Other ones looked at the Hermetic tradition and the works of Hermes Trismegistus, who they believed was an Egyptian magician. But more than anything, they were fascinated with the Jewish Kabbalah. And this was something that came to obsess many of the scholars in Lorenzo's circle, none more than Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And Pico della Mirandola is, of course, very famous for his 900 Theses, but he also wrote the Heptaplus, which is a commentary on the Kabbalah. So he studied with many Jewish scholars, he learned Hebrew, and Mirandola wanted to create a synthesis of world knowledge to access the truths of the Bible and the eternal truths of all human learning. So he cites Saracen sources, he cites Jewish sources in his 900 Theses. He and Ficino frequented a circle of Jewish scholars, including Elia del Medigo and Flavio Mitridate. They also associated with Johannin Alemanno, and I'll be ending my talk today coming back to Alemanno, very, very important thinker and scholar in Florence at the time. And of course, Leone Ebreo. Leone Ebreo, whose actual name was Judah Leon Abravanel, the son of Isaac Abravanel, a very recognized family of Jewish scholars and physicians, merchants. In fact, later on in the Grand Duchy, there will be a number of Abravanels who are quite well known associating with the Medici family. Leone Ebreo wrote this dialogue on love that was like a bestseller at the time. The ideas that he explored, the dialogue between Philo, who's a man, and Sophia, a woman, philosophy, was something that was intriguing to the not just to the Neoplatonists, but to so many of the people at the time, because it was so engagingly written. But what I want to say is, when Pico della Mirandola came up with these 900 Theses, which he had hoped to present at the Vatican, and he wanted to change the world, it all fizzled out. He was not able to present it, but his nephew, much later, gave the 900 Theses the very catchy title of the Oration on the Dignity of Man. And it's come to us today as almost a manifesto of Renaissance belief in the importance and centrality of the human spirit in God's creation. And this is just a brief blurb from Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man. But this synthesis that he put together, in it, he claims that Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, contains the essence of all the other philosophies that he is expressing within these 900 Theses. So I think it's very interesting that, what has come down as one of the essential foundational works of, Renaissance intellectual belief, almost the poster child, as I've put, Leonardo's Vitruvian Man up there as an image for the Renaissance spirit, could not have existed without this interplay between Florentine intellectuals and Jewish intellectuals in the city of Florence. Okay, when Lorenzo de' Medici dies in 1492, a lot of things change in Florence. This is a time that sees the ascendancy of that figure that I started out by talking about, Girolamo Savonarola. He was a Dominican friar from Ferrara. He was an outsider. He came to Florence with a very, very harsh message of austerity, telling the Florentines to give up all the opulence, to give up all their vanities. Later on, when he comes to have great power and sway over the Florentines, he oversees bonfires of the vanities on which musical instruments and pagan texts and various items of luxury are burnt symbolically. He tells Florentines they have to repent. All people in the Italian peninsula are going to suffer if they do not go back to a very, very austere kind of Christianity. And there is going to be an invasion. Savonarola presents himself as a prophet, telling the Florentines, if you fix yourselves, like in that first sermon on Haggai that I read to you, you can become the city of God. You can become Jerusalem on earth. But if you don't, you're going to suffer from these invasions. And the Florentines are overwhelmed with him, especially when in 1494, there actually is the invasion of the French, the first of the two French invasions of the Italian peninsula. But the years between 1492 until 1498 are years that are very difficult and trying for the Jewish community in Florence. For one thing, in 1493, there was an incident outside Or San Michele, and you probably pass by this statue every day if you live in Florence. This is the symbol of the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild, this Madonna and Child. At the very base of the statue here is written in Latin an inscription that says, this statue was attacked by a Jew, and he himself was torn apart by the mob. By the way, this Latin inscription is attributed to Angelo Poliziano. Once again, you can see it's not always a simple story, the appreciation of Italian humanists for Jewish people. It does not always translate in pro-Jewish sentiment, the fact that they're reading Jewish texts. And this was not the only outbreak of violence against a Jew. But I want to point out that the ascendancy of Savonarola, an outsider from Ferrara, is very indicative. The local Florentine church was not specifically anti-Jewish. It was mostly outsiders that stirred up the mob, like Bernardino da Feltre that I told you about before, who was from the Veneto. There was also an incident that happened in 1458 when a Franciscan friar, many Franciscan friars preached anti-Jewish rhetoric. He came from Milan, and he had to be scolded by Archbishop Antoninus. When this Franciscan continued preaching, and he was stirring the mob to more and more violence, the priors of Florence had to have him expelled from the city. He was actually escorted out the city gate to leave. And once again, just to emphasize the fact, Savonarola himself was an outsider too. But I want to say, despite his immense spiritual prestige and the popular support that Savonarola had from the Florentine people, Savonarola was not able to drive the Jewish community out of Florence, although he would have liked to. Savonarola became very, very prominent between the years 1494 to 1498, once the Medici were expelled from the city. So when the Medici were expelled, there was no more protection for the Jews, and specifically, Savonarola wanted to change the system of poor relief. He wanted to establish the Monte di Pietà. In 1495-96, that was established as a charitable institution, a state-sponsored lending scheme to get money to the poor. This meant, of course, that he wanted to expel all the Jewish bankers. It went along with his, his antipathy to the Jewish people, and it also served his purposes to promote the Monte di Pietà. Unfortunately, the Jewish bankers were very useful for lending money to the commune during this time. The Jewish banks made a 16,000 florin loan to the Florentine Republic, which was in dire need of funds because there was a long war with the city of Pisa that they'd been engaged in, and of course, expenses that were connected to funding the French King Charles VIII's expedition throughout the peninsula was very costly. So by granting this loan, the Jewish community gained another 15 years of breathing space. Savonarola, the instigator of these bonfires of the vanities, himself came to a very fiery end in 1498 when he and his followers were burnt in the Piazza della Signoria. This was not the end of the trials, though, for the Florentine people, because the Florentine Republic continued, and it continued without the Medici. After freeing itself from Medici domination, the Florentine Republic turned against the Jews. When the Medici finally returned in 1530, then the Jews finally breathed a long sigh of relief. So everything that was good for the Florentine Republic was not necessarily good for the Jewish people, and vice versa. Now, in conclusion, where do I want to go with this talk? I want to go back to where I started with the rather polemical title that I've given to today's lecture, A New Jerusalem. In what sense was Florence a kind of haven for the Jews? The historian Diane Owen Hughes has said, by the beginning of the 15th century, northern Italy had over 200 Jewish communities, perhaps 20 times the 12th century figure. So we're seeing an enormous growth in the Jewish population and a flourishing of Jewish culture across the peninsula. And despite periodic outbreaks of violence of the kind I've described, overall, Jewish life continued in Italy as it had for centuries. For some Jews, Italy must have seemed like a place of uncommon safety and peace. Following the expulsions from Spain in 1483 and with the Reconquista in 1492, the forced conversions in Portugal in 1497, and the 1506 Lisbon massacre, particularly Jews fleeing the Iberian Peninsula were attracted to immigrate to various cities in the Italian peninsula. The 1590s saw a huge flow of Jewish immigration into Italy. The historian Cecil Roth very optimistically has written, in no part of the world does such a feeling of friendliness prevail between the people and the Jews as in Renaissance Italy. This did not last, however. The 16th century, with the Protestant Reformation, saw the opening of a Pandora's box of hostility. What followed was the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, the wars of religion, and for the Jews, what has been called the Age of the Ghetto. In 1516, the Venetian Ghetto was formed, and it was followed in 1555 after Pope Paul IV's papal bull, Comnimus Absurdum, by the creation of the Roman ghetto and ghettos across the Italian peninsula. Indeed, in 1570-71, the Jewish ghetto in Florence was established by Grand Duke Cosimo I and his son Francesco I. And it was established here in this region around where the current day Piazza della Repubblica stands. This was, however, sort of against Cosimo's will. Cosimo was quite sympathetic to Jewish merchants, like his forebears had been, but because the Pope had just created the Grand Ducal title in 1569, he couldn't exactly look a gift horse in the mouth, and he agreed to create a ghetto in Florence, and also in Tuscanate territory in other areas. His son, however, Ferdinando I, was of a completely different mindset. He created the free port of Livorno, known as Leghorn in English, and the groundbreaking Livornine laws, first in 1591 and then in 1593, that guaranteed that Jews could live in both Livorno and in Pisa without being enclosed within the walls of a ghetto. So in both Livorno and Pisa, Jews had freedom of movement, the right to practice their religion, to own property, to govern themselves. They had very favorable business conditions, and most of all, they were protected from persecution. These were groundbreaking laws that were set up by Ferdinando I in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Now, it may sound like I'm hyping this, and if you think that I'm going too far, let me read to you from Manasseh ben Israel's account of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Because Manasseh ben Israel was a Jewish physician and he was a rabbi. He was raised in the Netherlands, and he traveled to England in 1655 in order to persuade the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, to readmit the Jews to Britain. And in this pamphlet, he proposed the model of Pisa and Livorno. Let's let the Jews in, and let's come up with an accord like the one that the Grand Duke of Tuscany has come up with. And in this treatise, he writes, in Italy, Jews are protected by all princes. He talks about Venice, Padua, Verona, Mantua, even in Rome, he says. But he says, the best place of all for the Jews is in the government of the great Duke of Tuscany. They are by that prince most graciously and bountifully dealt with, having power from him granted to have their judicatory by themselves and to judge in all matters, both civil and criminal, besides many other privileges, whereof I have myself have the copies in hand. He brought the actual copies of the Livornine laws to show to Cromwell when he went to London. Okay. Livorno, by this point, was the second largest Jewish population of Sephardic Jews in early modern Europe. It was second only to Amsterdam. Although there were less than 1,000 in 1591, by the late 18th century, there were over 40,000 Jews in Livorno. So we're seeing a very successful Jewish settlement here. Now, I said I wasn't going to leave the Renaissance and the Quattrocento. So in finishing up my talk now, I'm just going to cite Johannes Alemanno, who I spoke about before as being influential on the Neoplatonic philosophers in Lorenzo de' Medici's circle. And he lived for many years in the city of Florence between 1455 to 1494. And he was the guest of a rich and cultured banker, but as I also indicated, he interacted a lot with Pico della Mirandola and Lorenzo de' Medici. And in fact, in his commentary on Song of Songs, he dedicates that to Pico della Mirandola, and he talks about Lorenzo de' Medici, comparing him to Solomon, and talks about him as the most perfect of princes. So this is what Johannes Alemanno writes in his commentary. It is 20 years now since I began my commentary on the words of Solomon. Until the time I returned in 1488 to a land whose political leaders are great and noble, endowed with regal virtues, whose merchants are the wisest among all of God's children, a land from whose hills arose the most precious man of our times. His name is Lorenzo de' Medici, whose prudence and abundance of spiritual understanding transcend the comprehension of common people. He rules his dominions with wisdom, knowledge, prudence, and mercy. It is his highest wish to better the fortunes of all those who arrive at the gates of his city, that splendid city, a city that is loyal and worthy of adoration. God bestowed on her riches, honor, and virtue above all others. Glorious Florence, whom God in his holiness honored with the utmost beauty. So you see, to Johannes Alemanno, to one Jew at least, Florence was a kind of New Jerusalem. Okay, I will end here and open up the floor to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know any of that, and it was just really nice to see the story of the Jews from the early days through. And I'll shut up and let other people come in. Usual protocol, if you want to make a comment, ask a question to Lisa, please feel free to unmute yourself. But once you've finished talking, mute yourself up again, please, so that we don't get too much background noise. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Would it be possible to make?
Yes, Julia, off you go. Yeah.
Yes. I love the way the story is actually longer. You have Brunetto Latino journeying to Spain, and at the court of Alfonso el Savio, he meets Jews and Arabs translating Aristotle. And he brings that back to Florence, teaching it to Dante Alighieri, Guido Cavalcanti, and Francesco da Barberino. And Dante creates the Commedia, which is, in a sense, Florence as a New Jerusalem. Brunetto had written this treatise in which the podesta is elected from outside of Florence. He's the outsider.
Yes.
Comes to administer justice without corruption. And this was the concept in the Primo Popolo, the first Republic of Florence. And then it continued on beyond that, following, first they lost the Primo Popolo at the Battle of Monteperti,
Yes.
and then they were able to regain it. And then, of course, Dante was exiled. Savonarola, as the outsider, comes in as the podesta to create Florence as a kind of very austere New Jerusalem. But this concept of the New Jerusalem, it continues in the Risorgimento. You have Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who knew Hebrew, ending her epic poem, 9 books, Aurora Lee, with this marvelous scene of Florence and the Book of the Apocalypse. And then you have Giorgio La Pira, who was the mayor during, following the war, whose vision definitely was of Florence as a New Jerusalem, who also founded the Amicizia Ebraico-Cristiano. And I was invited to one of their meetings in a garden, and it was absolutely lovely, by Fioretta Mazzei. And I see this as a continuum. Yes, there are times when it backtracks and so forth. And then there are these times of cultural openness,
Yes.
which have made Florence's greatness.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think it's easy to get too triumphalistic and say, oh, it was a wonderful place to be a Jew and Florence was always great. It wasn't always great, but there were enough of these interesting moments of coming together and, you know, and interchange that make it so valuable. And thank you for the, you know, the comments on Brunetto Latini and updating us up to La Pira. That's a wonderful perspective.
I have a question, Lisa. You showed when you were talking about the ghetto in Florence, you showed a picture of the ghetto in the 19th century. And then you spoke about how in Livorno and Pisa things were liberated. Did the ghetto in Florence stay in place for 300 years? Is that what you're telling us?
Until it was destroyed in the 1880s. It was in place. And also, of course, I should point out that it wasn't the only ghetto in Tuscany. There were ghettos in Siena and elsewhere throughout the Tuscan state.
How long was it actually enforced for?
How long was it actually enforced? Through the Napoleonic era, I believe. Can somebody give me a better update on that? No?
No. But for a long time, basically.
For quite a long time. Oh, let me also point out that the best work that I know of on the Florentine ghetto is by Stephanie Zygmunt. And on my website, I've put a bibliography because I expect these kind of difficult questions from the crowd. So on lisakaborycha.com, if you go to resources, I've got a whole bibliography of writings about this period. But I'm not particularly an expert on the Florentine ghetto because I was looking at the situation of Jews outside of the ghetto context. There are many people who are focused very tightly on that. And ghetto culture is something that is a fascinating topic all on its own because, for instance, a few years ago, there was the 500-year anniversary of the founding of the Venetian ghetto. And you wouldn't expect that a lot of Jews would get up and celebrate the creation of a ghetto. But in fact, the ghetto culture was a very specific, very, very rich and deep expression of Jewish culture. And it's something that is very there's conflictual feelings about it. So it's an interesting topic, but once again, it's not my particular specialty.
May I say, Lisa, that I loved your lecture and you could come back every week.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, everyone.
We'll get you back in the autumn, Lisa, with a fan club like that.
Well, I could do a follow-up lecture because I would love to show you all the discoveries that I found about the Jews in Pisa, because there were fascinating documents that had to do with these merchants that were here and not enclosed within the the four walls of the ghetto.
Graham.
Thanks for a really fascinating lecture. Do you happen to know when the first recorded attested presence of Jews in Florence was? In the early Christian period or later?
That's a very tricky question. There seems to be evidence. If you go to Ravid, he's got some information about that. I'm trying to remember, Cecil Roth is still a good source, even though very, very old. Because Jews were not officially permitted until 1427, it's really hard to get an official pinpoint of that date. But I believe that the earliest record is in the 1300s, but I can't give you a particular specific date. I'm sorry about
that. We live in Monte San Savino, which is in the province of Arezzo, and we have a very interesting history of Jews in that actually quite small town. We have a synagogue, you may be familiar, some of you may be familiar with that, which has been restored over a period of many years. We have also a Jewish cemetery outside the walls of Monte San Savino, which was recently, in the last few years, rededicated and protected because it was being constantly vandalized for the very old tombstones that were there. That's a very interesting subject. Generally, the community of Jews was there because the Jewish bankers were sent to make loans to small loans to basically for agrarian purposes.
From Florence, they were sent by Florence.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really good point that you raised, because most of these Jewish bankers who were making loans, these were little loans. When I showed you those four main banking houses in Florence in the Quattrocento, there were over 100 Florentine banks. And the amount of capital that's been shown that the Florentine bankers introduced was not a whole lot. The impact was not immense. So I can see what you're saying about like Monte San Savino and some of these other communities where they would span outwards in order to provide these small loans to people. Yeah, good point. Good detail.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Lisa, thank you. It was fantastic. And my head's a little bit spinning. So questions about who's doing the work currently. I'm a Renaissance art historian, by the way, that's connecting this philosophical and Neoplatonic bent and its rise and fall in Florence between sort of 1300 and 1600 or so, and then connecting that to what's happening art historically, right? Florence is, in terms of the work being produced, right, a number of Jewish heroes show themselves. We won't even start with David, but I'm thinking of Jewish heroines, back to Castagno's frescoes at Careggi, and the number of sort of Jewish heroines that show up, the fact that the Old Testament is what's focused on in Gibeon's Gates of Paradise, that the use of something I've always been interested in, but is far outside my field, the use of what appears to be Jewish prayer shawls as tablecloths in the history of these, right, in the Last Suppers that are shown in all of these refectories in Tuscany particularly. I'm wondering, is that you, or is there someone? I would love to know more about who's connecting all of that.
I would send you to Diane Owen Hughes. The article that I referred to, it's called Identifying Signs, I think. But if you look up Diane Owen Hughes, you can find it on JSTOR, because she speaks a lot about the textiles that are used and sort of evidence within art history.
Yeah.
And if you start with her and her bibliography, you should be able to find a lot more material on that. In terms of the Old Testament scenes, of course, proliferate throughout the Renaissance, but specifically with the greater number of, Jewish people and familiarity with Jewish culture, it becomes much more, authentic, so yes.
Yeah, I think that exists even with script, right? I'm thinking about those early paintings, and there's a switch at some point from a kind of pseudo-Hebrew text, right, that appears in some altarpieces and things that then sort of switches at some point, maybe in the 16th century, I'm trying to think, when we sort of begin to get more pseudo-Kufic as opposed to pseudo-Hebrew. But if that connects with the translations that are being made, right, that there's a lot that just gets pulled together, I think.
Sure. And fantastic. More people who actually know Hebrew, so you can have real Hebrew.
Right,
too.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Any more?
I'll ask a question which is related only in a tangential way. My husband and some colleagues are doing research for which will hopefully become a televised series. Is there anyone on the call who has knowledge of any Jewish food experts in Florence?
Ooh.
Either Ashkenazi or Sephardic.
Yeah, either Ashkenazi or Sephardic.
Any food experts? Not me.
I'm not a food expert, but there's a new Jewish restaurant opening up across from the synagogue, right on the corner where there used to be a different restaurant. It's not open yet, but it's they might be a good source for that.
Oh, that's an idea. Thank you so much for that.
It's not like a vegetarian one like the one right next to the synagogue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we are, my husband is Jewish, is aware of Jewish food historians and experts in other parts of Italy, especially Venice and other places, but in Florence, don't
also,
really have.
The silversmith people, I think it's Pamploni, they have a Jewish restaurant in their silver works in Florence. So they might be a source of at least directing you to somebody who might, or they might know, because they actually have a proper kosher restaurant. So.
Thank you for that.
That's all I know.
Okay. Who's next? Are we done? We're past the hour, so we're allowed to go off and have our evenings now. Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Simon. And Lisa, thank you. It was absolutely fascinating.
Well, I mean, this is always a thrill to be able to share, my studies with all of you. And
well, thank you very much, Lisa, and let's find a date sometime in the autumn for part 2, as you've suggested. That will be great. And thanks everyone for attending. Don't forget to go to Just Giving for your little donations, and we'll see you all next week for Jeremy on the Sesto di San Pietro di Scaragio. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
See you.